A retired Navy SEAL thought his war was over, until his German Shepherd stopped suddenly beside a frozen lake and refused to move. What the dog sensed that morning would pull him back into a mission far more dangerous than anything he expected. Within hours, mercenaries, a stolen military device, and a hidden conspiracy would turn a quiet lighthouse into the center of a deadly countdown. But sometimes the difference between disaster and survival isn't a weapon. It's loyalty, instinct, and the courage to act when others hesitate. In this story, one man and one dog will face armed enemies, rescue the innocent, and uncover a plan meant to throw an entire region into chaos. And in the middle of the danger, they will discover something even more powerful: purpose, faith, and the strange ways destiny finds us when we least expect it. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and how this story makes you feel. And if you enjoy stories like this, please like and subscribe so we can reach our first 1,000 subscribers and keep bringing you more powerful stories. Morning came slowly to Iron Lake. In the far north of Minnesota, winter never left in a hurry. Even in early spring, the lake still carried a skin of pale ice that glimmered under the rising sun. Light spread across the frozen surface like molten metal, reflecting gold and silver through the thin mist drifting above the water. The surrounding pine forest stood tall and silent, their dark needles barely moving in the cold northern wind. It was the kind of morning that looked peaceful from a distance, the kind of place where nothing violent was supposed to happen. But Calder Knox had learned long ago that quiet landscapes often hid the worst storms. Calder stood about 6 feet tall, just over 1.83 meters, with the lean, compact strength of a man who had spent most of his adult life in combat zones rather than gyms. His build wasn't bulky or showy. It was the practical muscle of a soldier who had carried gear across mountains and deserts. His face was clean-shaven, exposing the hard structure of his features: a square jaw, pronounced cheekbones, and a straight nose slightly crooked from an old break. His skin was light, but weathered by wind and cold, the kind of pale tone that had turned rough from years outdoors. His dark brown hair was cut short in a military style, though slightly longer than strict SEAL regulations would have allowed, just enough length to show that he no longer answered to a command structure, but not enough to forget the discipline he once lived by. His eyes were gray-blue, sharp and observant. The eyes of a man who noticed movement before sound. This morning, Calder wore the same clothing he wore almost every day: an old olive-gray tactical combat shirt, softened with years of wear. The cuffs were frayed slightly, and the shoulders carried faint patches of faded color where fabric had rubbed against gear straps and cold weather jackets. His combat pants, a worn earth-brown pair, hung loose enough for movement, but showed the fatigue of time. The knees were scuffed pale from kneeling on gravel, and the cargo pockets sagged slightly from long use. Heavy military work boots pressed firm against the frozen ground. On his wrist sat a scratched military watch, the glass marked with thin lines from years of field work. He checked the time without thinking. 5:42 a.m. Same time he woke every day. 3 years had passed since Calder left the Navy SEALs. 3 years since a mission in Eastern Europe had collapsed into chaos. 7 men had gone in. 4 came out. Calder was one of them. The cabin by Iron Lake had been his way of disappearing, or at least trying to. A low movement brushed through the snow beside him. Atlas. The German Shepherd moved ahead of Calder by half a step, as he usually did. The dog was about 4 to 5 years old, a strong working male with the balanced build of a trained military dog rather than the oversized frame of a show breed. His coat carried the classic black and tan coloring. A deep black saddle ran down his back from neck to tail, while his chest, legs, and muzzle showed a warm, golden tan color, like sunlit sand. His fur around the neck was thick and slightly raised in the cold air. Atlas's amber-brown eyes were alert, scanning the tree line. A small scar cut across the edge of his left ear, a reminder of a mission overseas Calder rarely spoke about. The dog wore a simple black leather collar. No tags, no decoration. Atlas wasn't a pet. He was a partner. Calder and Atlas ran the perimeter path around the lake every morning. It was a routine both of them had fallen into without discussion. Calder trusted routines. Routines kept the mind from wandering. They had been moving for about 15 minutes when Atlas suddenly stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. His body stiffened. Ears forward. Nose lifted slightly into the wind. Calder immediately slowed. He had seen that posture too many times before. Atlas only looked like that when something was wrong. The dog took 2 slow steps forward, then suddenly bolted toward the eastern shoreline. "Atlas," Calder muttered. The dog ignored him. Calder followed. They reached a narrow clearing where an old, abandoned dock stretched into the frozen lake. The woodboards were warped and gray with age. A rusted rescue boat sat tied loosely beside it, covered by a torn tarp. The place hadn't been used in years. But something had happened here recently. Calder saw it immediately. 3 spent rifle casings glinted in the snow. He crouched, gloved fingers brushing one. Still clean, not weathered, fresh. Nearby, a set of tire tracks cut across the frozen shoreline. Not civilian tires. These were wide and deep, the pattern typical of off-road tactical vehicles. And then something worse. A drag mark across the snow. Something or someone had been pulled across the ground toward the boat. Atlas growled softly. The sound vibrated low in his throat. The dog moved toward the rescue boat and began barking. Not a warning bark, a demand. Calder stepped onto the dock carefully, the wood creaking under his boots. He pulled back the torn tarp. Under it was a metal storage compartment. Locked. Atlas pawed at it violently. Calder pulled a small tool from his pocket and snapped the cheap padlock in seconds. He lifted the hatch. Inside lay a man, bound, bruised, barely conscious. The man looked to be in his early 40s. His build was slender, more academic than physical, with narrow shoulders and long fingers that suggested years of laboratory work rather than field labor. His dark blonde hair was matted with sweat, and a pair of thin wireframe glasses hung crooked on one ear. His skin had the pale look of someone who spent too much time indoors. But his eyes, when they flickered open, were sharp, intelligent, terrified. "Easy," Calder said quietly. The man coughed. His voice came out hoarse. "My name, Rowan Pierce." Calder cut the rope around his wrists. Pierce winced as circulation returned. "I'm a scientist," he managed. "Energy systems." Atlas sniffed the man carefully, nose moving across his coat. Then the dog stiffened again. Something about Pierce's clothing smelled wrong. Fuel, metal, explosives. Pierce grabbed Calder's sleeve suddenly. "They're trying to activate it," he said urgently. Calder frowned. "Activate what?" Pierce's voice dropped. "A tactical energy module. He swallowed. And I'm the only one who can unlock it. For a brief second, the quiet lake seemed to hold its breath. Then, a gunshot cracked through the trees. The bullet slammed into the wooden post beside Calder's head, splintering it violently. Atlas barked with explosive fury. Pierce froze. Calder's instincts moved faster than thought. He shoved Pierce down behind the boat and drew the pistol from the holster at his waist. Another shot rang out. Snow burst near the dock. Voices shouted from the tree line. More than one. Atlas crouched low, teeth bared. Calder looked toward the forest. 3 figures moved between the trees, black clothing, rifles raised, returning. Not hunters, not locals, professionals. Calder exhaled slowly. 3 quiet years had passed since he fired a weapon in anger. But muscle memory doesn't forget. He checked the pistol. Loaded. Atlas's ears twitched. The dog leaned slightly forward, waiting for the command that had once meant everything. Calder's voice came out calm. "Stay sharp, buddy." Another rifle cracked through the cold morning air. The war Calder Knox thought he had left behind had just found him again. And Iron Lake was no longer quiet. The first thing Calder Knox noticed after the gunfire stopped was the silence. Not the peaceful silence of Iron Lake mornings. This one felt tense, pressurized, the kind of silence that meant someone was still watching. Calder stayed crouched behind the old rescue boat for several seconds after the attackers disappeared into the pine forest. His pistol remained steady in both hands, arms locked but relaxed, his breathing slow and controlled. Atlas stood beside him, body angled toward the tree line. The German shepherd's black saddle fur rippled slightly in the wind, but his amber eyes never left the woods. Waiting. Listening. The forest gave nothing back, only the distant creak of frozen branches. After nearly a minute, Calder lowered the pistol slightly. "Clear," he muttered. Dr. Rowan Pierce pushed himself up slowly from behind the metal compartment. His movements were stiff and shaky, the kind that came from both exhaustion and adrenaline. Up close, Pierce looked worse than Calder first thought. He was around 41, thin-framed with narrow shoulders and long arms, the posture of someone who had spent decades leaning over lab tables rather than lifting heavy equipment. His dark blonde hair, normally combed neatly from the way it fell, was now tangled with sweat and snow. His pale skin carried the bruised shadows of someone who had not slept in days. A deep purple mark had formed across his jaw. His wire-frame glasses hung crooked on his face. Despite all of that, his eyes were still alert, sharp, the eyes of a man whose mind worked faster than fear. Pierce swallowed hard and looked toward the forest. "They came back quicker than I expected." Calder glanced at him. "You expected them?" Pierce gave a humorless breath of air that might have been a laugh. "I know the kind of people who hired them." Calder stood and scanned the shoreline again. No movement. He holstered his pistol, but kept his hand close to it. Atlas stepped forward, sniffing the air again. The dog's nose moved slowly along Pierce's coat. Then Atlas growled softly. Calder noticed. "What is it?" Pierce looked confused. Atlas pulled back slightly and sniffed again. "Kithsin," he turned his head toward the frozen lake. Calder crouched and inspected Pierce's jacket. The smell hit him instantly. Jet fuel, industrial lubricant, and something else. A faint metallic scent Calder knew well. Military-grade electronics. Calder straightened. Start talking, he said calmly. Pierce hesitated. The wind brushed across the frozen lake, carrying small needles of snow across the surface. Then Pierce spoke. The device they stole is called a tactical energy module. Calder said nothing. Pierce continued. It was designed as a portable power core for emergency military infrastructure. In theory, it could stabilize power grids after large-scale disasters. In theory, Calder said. Pierce nodded. In reality, it can also generate a controlled electromagnetic pulse. Calder's expression didn't change, but his mind immediately ran through possibilities. EMP, local blackout, communication collapse. Range? Calder asked. Pierce wiped blood from the corner of his lip. If used correctly, it could knock out power coordination systems across the entire Lake Superior grid. Calder whistled quietly. That's not a toy. No, Pierce said. It's not. Atlas paced slowly around them, still alert. Pierce continued. The module has a biometric failsafe. Meaning? Pierce tapped his chest. It won't activate without my authorization. Calder stared at him. So they kidnapped the one man who can turn it on. Yes. Pierce's voice hardened slightly. They needed the key. Calder studied the scientist for several seconds. You escaped. Pierce nodded. During transport across the lake. How? Pierce hesitated, then said quietly, I disabled their container lock and jumped into the water when the boat slowed near the shore. Calder glanced at the frozen surface. That water would kill most people in 5 minutes. Pierce gave a weak shrug. I used to swim competitively. Atlas walked back and nudged Calder's leg. The dog's ears twitched again. Something still wasn't right. Calder looked back toward the forest. Those guys weren't amateurs, he said. Pierce nodded. They're not. Calder studied him again. Who hired them? Pierce didn't answer immediately. Instead, his gaze drifted across the frozen lake. For a moment, he seemed lost in thought. Then, Atlas suddenly froze. Completely. The dog lifted his head slowly. His body stiffened in a way Calder had never seen before. Atlas wasn't looking toward the forest this time. He was staring directly at Pierce. The German shepherd stepped closer to the scientist. Not aggressively. Carefully. Atlas tilted his head slightly and stared into Pierce's eyes. For several seconds, neither moved. Then Atlas did something strange. He lowered himself into a sitting position. Calm. Silent. Watching. Calder frowned. Atlas only did that when he was trying to read someone. Pierce noticed the dog's stare. What? He asked quietly. Atlas didn't blink. The dog's eyes held Pierce's for several long seconds. Then Atlas turned away. Just as suddenly, the tension left his body. Calder didn't say anything, but something about that moment stayed with him. Atlas trusted very few people, and apparently, Pierce had just passed some kind of test. The wind picked up across the lake. Pierce shivered. We should move, Calder said. Pierce nodded quickly. Where? My cabin. Calder started walking along the shoreline. Atlas moved ahead again, scanning the woods. They walked in silence for several minutes before Pierce spoke again. You asked who hired them? Calder nodded. Pierce inhaled slowly. Marcus Vane. Calder stopped walking. The name hit him like a punch to the chest. For a moment, the forest seemed to tilt around him. Marcus Vane. Calder turned slowly. Say that again. Pierce blinked. Marcus Vane. Calder's jaw tightened. Atlas sensed the change instantly and returned to Calder's side. Why do you know that name? Pierce asked. Calder didn't answer. Instead, he stared toward the frozen lake again. 3 years ago, Eastern Europe. A logistics coordinator attached to their mission. A contractor who controlled supply routes. Marcus Vane, the man responsible for the equipment delay that left Calder's team exposed during a night extraction. 4 men dead. The official report said it was an accident. But Calder had never believed that. Now the name had surfaced again. Pierce studied Calder carefully. You know him. Calder exhaled slowly. I used to. They continued walking. The trees grew thicker as they moved deeper into the forest. Calder's cabin sat about a mile from the abandoned dock, hidden among tall pines. Smoke rose faintly from the chimney when they arrived. Pierce stared at the cabin. You live out here alone? Calder shrugged. Mostly. Atlas circled the perimeter once before following them inside. The cabin interior was simple. Wood walls, a cast-iron stove, a small table covered with maps and tools. 2 rifles hung on a rack above the doorway. Pierce noticed them immediately. You kept your equipment. Calder poured water from a metal kettle into 2 cups. Some habits don't disappear. Pierce sat down heavily in one of the chairs. Atlas lay near the door, still watching the windows. Calder handed Pierce the cup. Drink. Pierce nodded gratefully. For a moment the cabin felt almost peaceful. But then Atlas stood again. His ears lifted. His head turned toward the forest. Calder froze. Atlas moved slowly toward the door. Then he growled. Low. Dangerous. Calder crossed the room in 3 steps and looked through the window. At first he saw nothing. Just trees. Snow. Wind. Then he spotted movement. 3 shadows moving through the forest. Then 2 more. 5 men. All carrying rifles. Pierce whispered behind him. They found us. Atlas barked once. Calder grabbed the rifle from the wall. His voice was calm. Too calm. Stay behind the table, he told Pierce. Outside, boots crunched in the snow. One of the approaching figures stepped forward slightly. A tall man with a rifle slung across his chest. He raised his voice. Dr. Pierce! Pierce went pale. The man continued. You're coming with us. Calder chambered around. Atlas bared his teeth. Pierce whispered. They won't stop. Calder nodded. I know. The first shot shattered the cabin window, and the quiet life Calder Knox built at Iron Lake ended in the sound of gunfire. The first light of morning crept slowly across Iron Lake. Snow-covered branches glowed faint gold as the sun rose above the pine forest. The violent echoes of gunfire from the night before had faded, replaced by the quiet hum of wind moving through frozen trees. Calder Knox had not slept. He sat on the edge of a wooden chair near the cabin window, rifle resting across his knees. His posture looked relaxed, but the stillness in his shoulders revealed something different. He was listening. Atlas lay near the door, head resting on his paws, but the German shepherd's eyes were open. The dog had not truly rested either. Outside, the snow showed dark scars from the fight. 2 bodies had been dragged away before dawn. The others had retreated into the forest. But Calder knew something about men like that. They didn't quit. Dr. Rowan Pierce stood beside the cast-iron stove, warming his hands over the faint heat. His pale face looked slightly healthier after a few hours indoors, but exhaustion still clung to him. The bruising along his jaw had darkened overnight. He looked like a man who had crossed a line he could not return from. "You think they'll come back?" Pierce asked quietly. Calder didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the tree line outside. "They will," he said. Pierce nodded slowly. "I thought so." Atlas suddenly lifted his head. His ears twitched. A distant mechanical sound drifted through the cold air, low, rhythmic. Calder stood. Helicopter blades. Pierce stiffened. "That's not them," he said quickly. Calder grabbed a pair of binoculars from the table and stepped outside onto the porch. The cold air hit his face sharply. The helicopter appeared seconds later, emerging over the pine forest like a dark shape against the pale morning sky. It wasn't military gray. It was matte black. Federal markings ran along the side. The aircraft circled once above the lake before descending toward the open snowfield near the Ranger Road. Calder lowered the binoculars. "Looks like someone else joined the party." Atlas stood beside him, watching the aircraft land. The rotor wash sent loose snow swirling across the frozen ground. After the helicopter settled, the door slid open. A woman stepped out first. She moved with the controlled confidence of someone used to being in dangerous places. She was about 5'8", tall and lean, her posture straight and balanced like someone trained in both discipline and physical endurance. Her dark brown hair was tied back in a low, practical knot that allowed a few loose strands to escape in the wind. Her skin had a pale olive tone, lightly weathered from travel and long hours outdoors rather than cosmetics. Her face was sharp and focused, high cheekbones, a narrow jawline, and observant brown eyes that scanned the area before she took 3 steps forward. This was Serena Holt, 34 years old, federal counterterrorism agent. She wore a dark gray tactical jacket over a black high-collar sweater, paired with fitted tactical pants and lightweight combat boots. Everything about her clothing suggested function rather than style. A pistol rested securely on her right hip. Serena looked toward the cabin. Then she began walking. Behind her came 2 additional figures. The first was a broad-shouldered man in his late 50s, with a thick gray beard and a forest ranger uniform. His weathered face carried deep lines from decades outdoors. His name was Hank Dyer, the senior ranger responsible for most of Iron Lake's surrounding wilderness. Hank had spent 40 years patrolling forests and snowfields. A former Marine in his youth, he carried himself with quiet steadiness. His flannel shirt and heavy ranger coat looked worn but reliable, much like the man wearing them. The second person stepping from the helicopter was younger, a technician wearing a dark winter parka and carrying a metal equipment case. He was slight, nervous-looking, probably early 30s, with narrow shoulders and round glasses fogging in the cold air. His name was Elliot Marsh, a federal communications specialist. Calder watched them approach. Atlas remained beside him. Serena stopped several feet from the porch. Her gaze moved from Calder to the dog, then to the cabin. "You must be Calder Knox," she said. Her voice was calm and direct. Calder nodded once. "You must be the reason a helicopter just landed in my backyard." Serena allowed the faintest hint of a smile. I'm Agent Serena Holt. She stepped closer. We've been tracking Marcus Vane for months. Calder's expression didn't change, but something hardened behind his eyes. Pierce appeared in the cabin doorway. Serena noticed him instantly. Her focus sharpened. "Dr. Rowan Pierce," she said quietly. Pierce blinked. "You know who I am?" Serena nodded. "You've been missing for 36 hours. Pierce rubbed the back of his neck. "I didn't exactly leave a forwarding address." Hank Dyer approached slowly, looking around the damaged cabin exterior. He let out a low whistle. "Looks like you had a busy night, Knox." Calder shrugged. "Quiet evening." Hank gave a dry chuckle. "Sure looks peaceful." Serena turned back to Pierce. "We need to talk about the tactical energy module." Pierce looked surprised. "You already know about it?" Serena nodded. "We know more than you think." She pulled a tablet from her jacket and opened a satellite image. The screen showed a map of northern Minnesota and Lake Superior. Serena pointed toward the eastern shoreline. "This is Iron Point Lighthouse." Calder leaned closer. The lighthouse sat on a narrow rocky peninsula extending into the lake. "It's a major emergency communications hub," Serena explained. "If someone disables it, maritime radar and grid coordination systems across the region go dark." Pierce nodded slowly. "That's exactly what the module could do." Serena looked at Calder. "Marcus Vane plans to create a blackout. Not for ideology," she continued. "For profit." Hank crossed his arms. "How does chaos make money?" Serena turned the tablet. "When power and communications collapse, private security and emergency infrastructure contracts spike overnight." She paused. "Vane's network already owns several shell companies positioned to benefit." Pierce exhaled slowly. "That's disturbingly clever." Calder stared at the lighthouse image. A memory surfaced. 8 years ago, Eastern Europe. A supply convoy delayed. Extraction compromised. 4 bodies left behind. Marcus Vane had controlled the logistics chain that night. Calder spoke quietly. "He's not just clever." He looked up. "He's patient." Rehook moment. Atlas suddenly moved. The German shepherd walked past Serena and down the porch steps. He stopped near the edge of the snow where the previous night's tracks remained. The dog lowered his head. Then he began sniffing slowly. His body moved carefully along a faint trail leading away from the cabin. Serena watched with interest. "What's he doing?" Calder didn't answer. Atlas continued forward. 10 feet. 20. Then he stopped again. The dog stared into the forest, perfectly still. For a long moment nothing moved. Then Atlas gave a single quiet bark. Not a warning, more like a signal. Calder followed the direction of the dog's gaze. Deep between the trees, sunlight caught something metallic, a tiny reflective surface. Serena squinted. "Is that?" Calder lifted the binoculars. He adjusted the focus. The object was small, black, mounted to a tree trunk. A camera. Fresh. Calder lowered the binoculars slowly. "They've been watching us since sunrise." Serena's expression tightened. Atlas had just revealed something none of them had noticed. Someone out there was still observing the cabin, and they were patient enough to wait. Serena exhaled. "That means Vane knows you survived." Pierce went pale. "That's bad." Hank scratched his beard thoughtfully. "Then we shouldn't be standing out here." Calder nodded. inside. They moved quickly into the cabin. Serena shut the door behind them. Elliot Marsh opened his equipment case and began setting up a portable signal scanner. His hands moved quickly, but nervously. "I can locate any nearby transmitters," he said. "Give me a minute." Atlas sat near the window, still watching the forest. Serena leaned against the table. "We need to move Pierce somewhere secure," she said. Calder looked at her. "Where?" Serena tapped the map again. "There's a decommissioned military storage facility about 20 miles north." Calder frowned. "Keeps equipment cold storage?" Serena nodded. "Exactly." Pierce's eyes widened slightly. "Storage Facility 14. Serena looked impressed. "You know it?" Pierce nodded. "I helped design its original power system." Calder crossed his arms. "That sounds convenient." Pierce sighed. "Trust me, I wish it wasn't." Elliot suddenly looked up from his scanner. We have a problem." Everyone turned toward him. Elliot pointed to the display. Multiple signals appeared. "Moving. Approaching." Serena's voice dropped. "How many?" Elliot swallowed. "More than before." Calder grabbed his rifle again. Atlas stood beside him. Outside, the forest remained silent. But this time the silence felt heavier, like something gathering. Serena looked at Calder. "If we're going to stop Marcus Vane," she nodded toward the map, "we need to leave now." Calder stared at the snowy woods outside. Then he looked at Atlas. The dog met his gaze calmly. For the first time in 3 years, Calder Knox felt the familiar pull of something he thought he'd buried. A mission. And this time he wasn't walking away. The drive north from Iron Lake took nearly an hour. Snow-covered forest roads twisted through miles of silent pine wilderness. The convoy moved slowly, 2 vehicles cutting across narrow frozen paths that had not seen traffic in years. Calder Knox sat behind the wheel of the first truck, his posture calm but alert. The old engine hummed beneath his hands as the tires crunched over packed snow. Beside him sat Serena Holt, studying a tablet mounted against the dashboard. The faint glow from the screen illuminated the sharp lines of her face. Behind them in the back seat, Dr. Rowan Pierce leaned forward, gripping the headrest as the vehicle bounced across uneven ground. His bruised face still carried signs of the beating he had endured, but his voice had regained some strength. In the passenger footwell, Atlas sat upright, watching the trees flash by through the window. The German shepherd had been restless since they left the cabin. His amber eyes tracked every shadow moving through the forest. Calder noticed. "He senses something," Serena said quietly, without looking up. Calder nodded. "He usually does." The second vehicle followed behind them. Inside it were Hank Dyer and Elliot Marsh. Hank drove with the calm patience of someone who had navigated these woods for decades. The old ranger's thick gray beard moved slightly as he spoke to Elliot beside him. Elliot, wrapped in a heavy parka, looked less comfortable. He had spent most of the trip staring nervously at the forest. "Relax," Hank told him. "I am relaxed," Elliot replied. "You're gripping the dashboard like it owes you money." Elliot didn't laugh. "Just saying, this place feels like a horror movie." Hank grinned. "Son, the only scary thing in these woods is winter." The road narrowed. Soon the trees opened into a wide clearing. At the far end stood a cluster of long, low concrete buildings. The structures were partially buried in snow, their steel doors rusted and their windows covered by decades of grime. A faded government sign leaned crookedly near the entrance. U.S. Defense Storage Facility 14. Decommissioned, Serena studied the place carefully. This facility was shut down 12 years ago, she said. Cold storage for military electronics. Pierce nodded slowly. I remember helping design the power routing. Calder parked the truck behind a ridge of snow. They stepped out. The cold air bit instantly. Atlas jumped down first, paws crunching softly into the frost. He lowered his nose and sniffed the wind. Calder pulled binoculars from his pack and scanned the buildings. What he saw confirmed their fears. Movement. Men with rifles. At least a dozen. Parked near the main warehouse were two dark transport trucks, engines covered with camouflage netting. An antenna tower rose beside the building. Temporary communications. Serena adjusted the focus on her own binoculars. Mercenaries, she murmured. Hank leaned against the truck door. How many? About 12, Calder replied, plus whoever's inside. Pierce looked pale. That's where they're assembling the module. Serena lowered the binoculars. Then we shut it down. Calder nodded once, but the situation needed precision. He crouched in the snow and drew a quick map with a stick. We move after sunset, he said. 2 entry points. He pointed. Hank and Elliot cover the eastern door. Then he tapped the warehouse roofline. Serena and I go through the maintenance corridor. Atlas stood beside Calder as if listening. The dog's tail flicked slightly when Calder looked down. You're with me, Calder said quietly. Serena smirked. Good. I'd rather have the dog than half the agents I've worked with. The sun slipped lower in the sky. By nightfall, the forest had grown quiet. The temperature dropped sharply, turning the snow surface into hard glass. The team moved into position. Calder and Serena approached the warehouse from the west side, crouching behind stacked fuel crates left behind from years earlier. Atlas moved ahead of them like a shadow. Inside the building, faint lights glowed through dusty windows. Voices echoed faintly. Serena whispered, Ready? Calder nodded. She raised her suppressed pistol. Calder pulled open the side door. They slipped inside. The air smelled of metal and oil. Rows of storage containers filled the massive warehouse. Fluorescent work lights illuminated a central workspace where several men in dark tactical gear moved around a large metal structure mounted on a reinforced platform. The tactical energy module. Pierce had not exaggerated. The device was nearly the size of a generator, its casing surrounded by wiring and monitoring equipment. Serena whispered, That's it. 2 armed guards stood nearby. Calder signaled silently. Atlas crouched low. 3, 2, 1. The dog lunged. Atlas struck the first guard like a missile, knocking the rifle aside. Calder moved simultaneously, his suppressed pistol firing twice. The second guard collapsed before he could shout. Serena swept the room. Clear. They moved forward. Across the warehouse, Hank's team entered through the opposite door. Within seconds, the fight had begun. Gunfire cracked through the building as mercenaries scrambled for cover. Calder moved quickly between storage containers, firing controlled bursts. Atlas darted ahead, circling enemies and forcing them out of hiding. Serena kicked open a side room. Inside were 3 men tied to chairs. Technicians, hostages. She cut their restraints. You're safe, she said quickly. Stay down. The firefight ended within minutes. The surviving mercenaries fled into the forest. Calder stepped toward the module platform. The device hummed softly, but something was wrong. The central power housing was empty. Serena saw it too. The core's gone. Pierce arrived moments later, his face drained of color. They moved it. Calder's jaw tightened. Where? One of the rescued technicians staggered toward them. He was a short, middle-aged man with thinning brown hair and grease-stained gloves. His name tag read Victor Lasco. Victor's hands trembled as he spoke. They finished the core transfer an hour ago. Serena grabbed his arm. Where did they take it? Victor swallowed. They said something about the North Pumping Station. Calder frowned. What pumping station? Victor pointed vaguely through the wall. The old water treatment facility near the lake. Serena's eyes sharpened. That's perfect cover for power signatures. Calder nodded slowly. Before he could speak, Atlas suddenly froze. The German shepherd stepped away from the group. His nose lifted into the air. Atlas turned toward the far corner of the warehouse, not toward the exit, toward a dark hallway. The dog moved cautiously forward. Calder followed. The hallway led to a small security office. Inside, a single computer monitor flickered. Atlas stopped beside the desk. On the screen was a video feed. Not from the warehouse. From somewhere else. A rocky shoreline. Waves crashing against a tall, white structure. Serena stepped beside Calder. Iron Point Lighthouse. Calder's eyes narrowed. But the strange part wasn't the location. It was the timestamp. The video feed was live, and someone had left it running, almost as if they wanted someone to see it. Calder studied the empty chair beside the monitor. Whoever had been watching the feed had left in a hurry. But the camera still recorded. Serena spoke quietly. Marcus Vane wants us to know where he's going. Calder said nothing, but something about the situation felt deliberate. A trap, or a challenge. Atlas stared at the screen. His ears twitched slightly. The dog gave a low growl. The game had just changed. Serena turned back toward the others. We move now. Calder nodded. Outside, the night wind moved across the snow-covered clearing. The convoy of vehicles was already warming its engines. Far beyond the forest, waves crashed against Iron Point Lighthouse, and Marcus Vane was waiting. The northern pumping station stood at the edge of the lake like an aging skeleton of steel and concrete. Years ago, the facility had been a critical part of Iron County's infrastructure. Its long metal pipes and heavy filtration tanks had once supplied clean water to several surrounding towns. But modernization had moved the system elsewhere, leaving the old station half abandoned, maintained only enough to keep the structural systems from collapsing. Now, under the dim glow of floodlights and the constant mechanical rumble of industrial pumps, the place had become something else entirely. A staging ground. Snow drifted across the cracked asphalt outside as Calder Knox and the others arrived. The convoy stopped nearly half a mile away, along a frozen service road hidden by pine trees. The engines shut off one by one, leaving the night suddenly quiet except for the distant groan of water flowing through old pipes. Calder stepped out of the truck first. The cold air hit his face sharply, but he barely noticed it. His attention was fixed on the massive silhouette of the pumping station across the open ground. Beside him, Atlas jumped down silently. The German shepherd shook his thick black and tan coat once before lifting his nose into the wind. His ears twitched as he studied the dark industrial complex ahead. The dog looked tense, more tense than Calder had seen him since the first ambush. Serena Holt joined Calder beside the truck. She had pulled her dark tactical jacket tighter against the wind, but her posture remained composed and alert. Under the pale moonlight, the sharp lines of her face looked even more focused. She studied the plant through binoculars. "Lights are active inside," she said quietly. Calder nodded. "They're still here." Behind them, Hank Dyer climbed out of the second vehicle. The old ranger stretched his back with a quiet grunt. Even in his 60s, Hank moved with steady strength, though long years of patrol through forests had left his knees stiff in the cold. Elliot Marsh followed him, carrying his metal equipment case like it contained something fragile. "Tell me again why we're sneaking into an abandoned water plant at midnight," Elliot muttered. Hank chuckled under his breath. "Because it beats sitting behind a desk." Dr. Rowan Pierce stepped out last. He stared toward the facility with visible tension. The tall pipes and metal towers seemed to make him uneasy. "They must be using the filtration turbines," Pierce said. Calder glanced at him. "To hide the energy signature?" Pierce nodded. "The pumps generate enough electromagnetic noise to mask the module." Serena lowered the binoculars. "Which means the core is probably still inside." Calder turned toward the group. "We go quiet." He pointed toward the eastern side of the complex. "There's a maintenance channel leading to the pump tunnels." Pierce looked surprised. "You know the layout?" Calder shrugged. "I've broken into worse places." Atlas moved ahead as they approached the perimeter fence. The dog's movements were fluid and careful, his paws barely disturbing the snow. Every few steps he paused, nose low, scanning for unfamiliar scents. Calder cut through the rusted chain-link fence with bolt cutters. The metal snapped softly. The team slipped through the opening one by one. The pumping station loomed above them like a giant sleeping machine. Large pipes ran across the exterior walls, vibrating faintly with the movement of water deep inside. The low mechanical hum echoed across the yard. Atlas suddenly froze. He lowered his body slightly. Calder crouched beside him. "What is it?" Atlas stared toward a shadow between two storage tanks. A guard stepped out a moment later. The man was tall, wearing dark tactical clothing and carrying a rifle across his chest. His beard was thick and uneven, the kind grown by someone who had spent weeks in rough conditions. His shoulders were broad, and his posture carried the relaxed confidence of someone used to violence. A mercenary. Serena moved silently beside Calder. She raised her suppressed pistol. Calder nodded once. 2 shots whispered through the cold air. The guard dropped without a sound. They moved quickly toward the maintenance channel entrance. The metal hatch creaked softly as Calder opened it. A narrow ladder led down into darkness. The smell of damp concrete and machine oil rose from below. "Ladies first," Hank muttered to Serena. Serena rolled her eyes and descended. The rest followed. The tunnel beneath the plant was cramped and wet. Water dripped steadily from overhead pipes as the team moved deeper into the facility. Atlas led the way. The dog paused every few steps, listening carefully. Eventually, the tunnel opened into a wide pump chamber. Huge turbine machines filled the room. Their spinning blades roared through the metal housing as water rushed through the system. And there, near the center platform, stood the tactical energy module. Technicians worked around the device under the watchful eyes of armed guards. Several other workers were tied to chairs against the wall. Hostages. Serena leaned close to Calder. "We take the guards first." Calder nodded. Atlas crouched beside them. 3 seconds later, the room erupted into motion. Atlas lunged forward like a released arrow. The dog slammed into the nearest guard, knocking the rifle sideways. Calder fired twice. Serena dropped another mercenary before he could turn. Chaos filled the chamber. Gunfire echoed off the metal walls as Hank and Elliot entered from the rear tunnel. The hostages shouted as Serena cut their restraints. "Stay down," she ordered. Calder moved toward the module platform, but someone else stood there. A tall man with dark hair streaked with gray. Marcus Vane. He looked almost calm in the middle of the firefight. Marcus Vane was about 45, broad-shouldered with the lean strength of someone who had spent years in military logistics zones rather than direct combat. His face carried sharp, controlled features, high cheekbones, narrow eyes, and a faint scar along his temple. His beard was trimmed short and precise. Everything about him suggested discipline, but his eyes carried something colder. Calculation. Vane pressed a button on a handheld device. A digital timer flashed to life on the module console. "Too late," he said calmly. Calder raised his weapon, but Vane stepped backward toward a side door. Several mercenaries fired covering shots. Vane disappeared through the exit. Calder swore under his breath. Atlas barked sharply. In the middle of the chaos, Atlas suddenly stopped chasing the fleeing guards. Instead, the dog turned back toward the module. His ears lifted. He stared at the blinking timer. Calder followed his gaze. The display read, 0 hours, 4 minutes, 17 seconds. Pierce rushed forward. "That's the energy transfer countdown." Calder frowned. "What happens when it hits 0? Pierce swallowed. "The module completes synchronization with the core." Serena stared at the screen. "But the core isn't here." Pierce looked toward the open lake visible through the broken door. And suddenly his face went pale. "Then the core is already moving." Atlas growled softly. The dog seemed to understand something before the rest of them did. Somewhere beyond the plant, across the dark water, the final stage of Vane's plan had already begun. Calder turned back to the device. "Can you stop it?" Pierce nodded nervously. "I think so." The scientist began disconnecting power couplings with shaking hands. Serena and Hank secured the remaining mercenaries. Within seconds, the timer stopped. The module powered down. The room grew quieter. But outside, the roar of an engine suddenly echoed across the lake. Calder ran to the doorway. In the distance, a fast black boat cut across the dark water. At its stern stood Marcus Vane, and strapped to the deck behind him was a metal container. The missing power core. Calder clenched his jaw. Serena stepped beside him. "He's heading to Iron Point." Calder nodded. Atlas limped toward them. Only then did Calder notice the blood along the dog's side. A bullet had grazed him during the firefight. The wound wasn't deep, but it hurt. Calder knelt beside the dog. "You're okay," he murmured. Atlas wagged his tail once, stubborn as ever. Serena looked toward the dark water again. "We're running out of time." Calder stood slowly. The night air felt colder now. Marcus Vane had escaped, but the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Iron Point Lighthouse stood where the land ended. A jagged peninsula of black rock pushed into the gray water of Lake Superior, and at its tip rose the tall, white tower of the lighthouse. The structure had been built nearly a century earlier, long before modern radar stations and satellite navigation. Yet over time, the lighthouse had evolved into something more than a beacon. Hidden beneath the tower were communication systems, backup transmitters, and emergency coordination equipment that linked much of the lake's maritime traffic. If that system went down, the ripple effect would spread far beyond the shoreline. Radar would fail. Coastal power routing could collapse. Shipping lanes across Lake Superior would lose guidance. And somewhere in the middle of that chaos, Marcus Vane planned to profit. The sky was still dark when Calder Knox's boat cut across the cold water. The small patrol craft belonged to the County Rescue Service, but tonight it had become something else entirely. A war vessel. Calder stood at the wheel, guiding the boat through narrow channels between floating sheets of ice. The wind coming off the lake stung his face, carrying the smell of salt and frozen metal. Behind him, Atlas lay on the deck. The German shepherd's breathing was steady but slightly strained. The graze wound along his side had been cleaned and bandaged quickly back at the pumping station, but the dog still moved carefully. Even so, Atlas refused to stay behind. When Calder had tried to leave him, the dog had simply stood in front of the boat ramp and refused to move. Serena Holt crouched beside the cabin door, studying the lighthouse through night vision binoculars. Even under the faint green glow of the optics, her face remained focused and controlled. Serena had the look of someone who had spent years making decisions under pressure. She lowered the binoculars slowly. "Multiple heat signatures," she said. Calder didn't look away from the water. "How many?" "8 outside the tower. Maybe more inside." Calder nodded. "That tracks." Far behind them, another vessel moved quietly through the darkness. The second boat carried a small federal tactical unit Serena had called in earlier. 4 agents, highly trained, but they were still 15 minutes behind. And Marcus Vane was not the kind of man who waited patiently. The lighthouse grew larger ahead of them. The tall white tower reflected faint light across the lake. Beside it stood several temporary structures, portable generators, antenna rigs, and equipment crates arranged around the base. Marcus Vane had built a field command center. Calder slowed the boat. "We cut engines here." The motor died. Silence spread across the water. The boat drifted slowly toward the rocky shoreline. Atlas lifted his head. His ears twitched toward the wind. The dog stood carefully and walked to the edge of the boat, his amber eyes fixed on the tower. Calder crouched beside him. "You ready for this?" Atlas wagged his tail once. That was enough. They climbed onto the rocks. Cold waves slapped against the stone beneath their boots. Serena gestured toward the main access road. "Federal team hits the front." Calder nodded toward the rear cliffs. "We go around." Atlas moved ahead immediately, nose low. The ground behind the lighthouse was uneven, broken by narrow pathways used by maintenance crews over the years. It was also darker. Better cover. Calder followed the dog carefully. The tower loomed above them like a silent guardian. Lights flickered inside the upper windows. Somewhere inside that tower, Marcus Vane was preparing to activate the core. Serena suddenly stopped. Movement. 2 guards walked along the outer wall. Mercenaries, both armed with assault rifles. Calder raised his suppressed rifle. 2 quick shots cracked softly. Both men dropped. They dragged the bodies behind the rocks. Atlas sniffed briefly before moving forward again. The backside of the lighthouse revealed a narrow steel door half hidden behind a generator. Serena tried the handle. Locked. Calder stepped forward. One sharp strike from the rifle butt snapped the latch. The door opened. Inside was a spiral staircase. Old metal steps wound upward into darkness. The interior smelled like oil and salt water. Voices echoed faintly from above. Calder whispered, "We clear floor by floor." Serena nodded. Atlas moved ahead, climbing carefully. Halfway up the staircase, the dog stopped. His body froze. Calder crouched. "What is it?" Atlas sniffed the air. Then he turned his head toward a small side corridor. "A narrow maintenance passage," Serena whispered. "That's not on the blueprint." Calder nodded. "Probably older construction." Atlas stepped into the hallway. Calder followed. The corridor ended at a small service door. Through the crack, they could see the interior control room. Inside, several technicians sat tied to chairs against the wall. Hostages. 3 mercenaries guarded them, and standing beside the control console was Marcus Vane. Calder studied Vane through the narrow opening. For a moment, the world seemed to narrow. Marcus Vane looked exactly as Calder remembered. Older, yes. His dark hair now streaked with gray, his beard trimmed neatly along the jawline. But the same controlled stillness remained in his posture. The calm of a man who believed he was always 3 moves ahead. Vane stood beside the energy core container, speaking calmly to one of the technicians. Then suddenly, he stopped. Without warning, Vane turned his head slightly. Not toward the door. Toward the ceiling. Toward nothing visible. His eyes narrowed. Then he smiled faintly. Calder felt a strange chill move through him. It wasn't fear. It was recognition. Marcus Vane had the same instinct Calder did. The instinct that told a soldier when someone was watching. Vane stepped closer to the console. He pressed a button. A red light flashed across the equipment, and the digital display came alive. Serena whispered sharply, "He's starting the final sequence." Calder's jaw tightened. There was no more time. Calder kicked the door open. "Federal agents!" Serena shouted. Gunfire exploded instantly. Atlas launched forward like a black and gold blur. The German Shepherd slammed into the nearest guard, knocking him sideways into the metal railing. Calder fired 2 controlled shots, dropping another mercenary. Serena dove behind a console, returning fire. The room filled with smoke and the deafening crack of rifles. One mercenary grabbed a hostage as a shield. "Drop your weapons!" he yelled. Calder shifted position. Atlas circled the man slowly, then lunged. The guard screamed as the dog struck his arm. The hostage fell free. Serena fired. The last mercenary collapsed. For a moment the room fell silent except for the blinking console. Marcus Vane stood alone beside the core container. He looked almost amused. "Well," he said calmly. "Calder Knox." Calder aimed his rifle. "You remember me?" Vane tilted his head slightly. "Of course." His eyes moved briefly toward Atlas. "Still traveling with the dog, I see." Calder said nothing. Serena moved toward the console. "Pierce!" she shouted into the radio. "We need you here." Vane looked at the countdown display. 30 seconds. He stepped backward toward the balcony door. "Too late," he said quietly. Calder moved forward, but Vane had already slipped outside. The sound of a small helicopter engine roared to life beyond the tower. Calder ran to the balcony. A compact black helicopter lifted from the rocks below. Marcus Vane stood in the open doorway, holding the core container. The aircraft rose quickly into the dawn sky. Calder lowered his rifle slowly. The countdown timer blinked. 20 seconds. Pierce burst into the room moments later, breathless. He rushed to the console. His fingers flew across the controls. 10 seconds. 5. 2. The display went dark. The module shut down. Pierce sagged against the console in relief. Serena exhaled slowly. The hostages began to cry with relief. But Calder kept watching the horizon. The helicopter carrying Marcus Vane had already disappeared into the morning clouds. The war wasn't finished. Not yet. Dawn came slowly to Lake Superior. The horizon glowed faint silver as the first light of morning pushed through the low clouds above the water. The lighthouse at Iron Point stood silent now, its white tower washed in pale light. Hours earlier, the place had been filled with gunfire. Now only the sound of wind and distant waves remained. Inside the lighthouse control room, the tension had begun to fade. Technicians who had spent the night tied to chairs were now sitting against the walls with blankets wrapped around their shoulders. Several federal agents moved carefully through the room, cataloging equipment and checking the systems Marcus Vane had attempted to hijack. Serena Holt stood near the communications console, speaking quietly into a secure radio. Her voice carried the calm authority of someone used to reporting under pressure. "Yes," she said. "The module is secured. Hostages recovered. No EMP discharge." She listened for several seconds, then nodded. "Understood. We'll hold the site until your team arrives." Serena lowered the radio and exhaled slowly. The night had been long. Across the room, Dr. Rowan Pierce worked beside a dismantled section of the tactical energy module. The scientist's thin frame looked even smaller beneath the oversized winter jacket someone had given him. His bruised jaw had turned a deep shade of purple, but his hands were steady now as he carefully disconnected the remaining power couplings. Pierce had the look of a man who was used to solving problems with logic rather than adrenaline, but the past 24 hours had forced him into a world where both mattered. "This system won't power up again," Pierce said. Calder Knox nodded. "Good." Calder stood near the balcony doors, staring out at the water. The cold wind moved through his short dark hair, and the pale morning light highlighted the sharp lines of his clean-shaven face. For a moment, he looked like a statue carved from stone, but his thoughts were far from calm. Marcus Vane had escaped. The helicopter had vanished into the clouds before Calder could even line up a shot. Serena walked over beside him. "We'll find him," she said quietly. Calder didn't answer right away. Atlas sat beside his leg, watching the lake. The German shepherd's bandaged side rose and fell with slow breaths. Despite the injury from the firefight, the dog's posture remained alert. Atlas had refused to lie down since the helicopter disappeared. It was as if he was still waiting. Calder scratched the dog behind the ears. "You did good." Atlas wagged his tail once. A faint engine sound suddenly echoed across the lake. Serena turned toward the horizon. Another helicopter approached from the south. Federal reinforcement. The aircraft circled once before descending toward the rocky shoreline near the lighthouse. A tall man stepped out as the rotor blades slowed. He was somewhere in his late 40s, broad-shouldered with the confident stride of someone who had spent most of his career commanding others. His dark suit jacket was hidden beneath a heavy field coat, and his neatly trimmed salt and pepper beard gave him the appearance of a professor rather than a federal officer. This was Director Nathan Cole. Cole was the regional coordinator for the Federal Counterterrorism Division, a man known for calm decisions and relentless investigations. He climbed the lighthouse steps and entered the control room. His sharp gray eyes moved across the scene quickly. "Agent Holt." Serena nodded. "Director Cole." Cole studied the dismantled module. "So, this is the device that nearly shut down half the lake." Pierce stepped forward. Yes. Cole extended his hand. Nathan Cole. Pierce shook it cautiously. Rowan Pierce. Cole glanced toward Calder. And you must be Mr. Knox. Calder didn't move from the balcony door. Just Knox. Cole studied him for a moment. I've read your service record. Calder gave a small shrug. That file is old. Cole's expression remained neutral. Old records are often the most interesting. He turned toward Serena. Any sign of Vane? Serena shook her head. He escaped by helicopter. Cole sighed quietly. I suspected he might. Atlas suddenly stood. The dog walked toward the doorway slowly. His nose lifted. Calder noticed immediately. What is it? Atlas stepped onto the balcony again, his gaze fixed on the rocky shoreline below. Calder followed him outside. The wind had grown stronger with sunrise. Waves crashed harder against the rocks now. Atlas walked to the edge of the balcony and stared downward. Calder leaned over the railing. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then a flash of black metal caught his eye between two rocks near the waterline. Something partially hidden beneath a tarp. Calder frowned. Serena. She stepped beside him. What? Calder pointed. That wasn't there before. Serena grabbed binoculars. The tarp shifted slightly in the wind. Beneath it sat a compact helicopter. Small, unmarked. Serena's eyes widened. That's not the one that left. Calder nodded slowly. Backup transport. Director Cole joined them on the balcony. He followed their gaze. Interesting. Atlas barked once. The sound echoed across the rocks. Calder moved quickly. Let's check it. They descended the lighthouse stairs and crossed the uneven stone ground toward the hidden aircraft. Up close, the helicopter looked damaged. Its rotor blades were bent slightly, as if it had made a rough landing. The cockpit door hung open. Inside the seat lay a man. Unconscious. His dark tactical uniform was stained with blood near the shoulder. Calder reached inside and checked the pulse. Alive. Serena recognized him immediately. He's one of Vane's pilots. Director Cole crouched beside them. Looks like he didn't make the getaway. The pilot groaned slightly. Calder pulled him out of the seat and lowered him onto the rocks. The man's beard was short and dark, his face hardened by years of rough work. When his eyes opened, fear flashed through them. Where is he? The pilot muttered. Serena leaned closer. Where is Marcus Vane? The man swallowed. He switched aircraft. Calder frowned. Why? The pilot gave a weak laugh. Because he knew you'd chase the first one. Serena's expression hardened. He planned this. The pilot nodded slowly. He always does. Atlas stepped forward and sniffed the man's jacket. Then he sat down beside him. The dog's ears flicked once. Calder noticed the gesture. Atlas only sat like that when someone had stopped being a threat. Director Cole stood. We'll take him into custody. Calder stared out across the water again. The sun had finally broken through the clouds. Light spread across the lake like liquid gold. For the first time in 2 days, Iron Point Lighthouse looked peaceful. Serena walked over beside him. You did more than most people would have. Calder shrugged. I did what needed doing. She looked down at Atlas. The dog was now lying on the rocks, clearly exhausted. You're lucky to have him. Calder nodded. Yeah. He scratched Atlas gently behind the neck. A few hours later, federal vehicles filled the shoreline around Iron Point. Technicians dismantled the remaining equipment while agents secured the area. The tactical energy module was loaded into a reinforced transport crate. Dr. Pierce stood nearby, watching carefully as the device was sealed. Hard to believe something that small nearly caused so much damage, he said. Director Cole nodded. Technology always moves faster than wisdom. By mid-afternoon, the operation was complete. The hostages had been transported safely to the mainland. The Lighthouse systems were fully restored, and the investigation into Marcus Vane's network had already begun. But for Calder Knox, the fight had ended. 2 days later, Iron Lake looked exactly as it had before the chaos. The frozen shoreline glowed beneath a bright winter sun. The pine forest stood silent and calm. Calder sat on the wooden dock beside his cabin. Atlas lay beside him, the dog's bandage freshly replaced. Serena approached along the snow-covered path. She stopped beside them. "You realize, Tom," she said. "You just saved half the region." Calder watched the sunlight ripple across the lake. He reached down and rested his hand on Atlas's head. "No," he said quietly. "He did." Atlas wagged his tail, and for the first time in years, Calder Knox felt something he had almost forgotten. Peace. Stories like this remind us that courage does not always come from strength alone. Sometimes it begins with a quiet instinct, a moment of loyalty, or a choice to stand up when walking away would be easier. Calder thought he had left his battles behind, but in the end, the path back to purpose came through something simple and unexpected: trust, loyalty, and the willingness to protect others. There are moments in life that feel like coincidence, but sometimes they are something more. Sometimes they are small reminders that we are being guided. In this story, a loyal dog's instinct led a man back to the place where he could do good again. Many people would call that chance. Others might call it something greater. Some would say it is how God quietly moves in our lives, placing us where we are needed most, even when we cannot see the whole plan. In our everyday lives, we may never face mercenaries or life-threatening missions, but we all face moments when we can choose courage over fear, kindness over indifference, and faith over doubt. Sometimes the greatest difference we can make begins with a single decision to help someone who needs it. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to reflect on the people and moments in your own life that may have been quiet miracles. Share this story with someone who might need encouragement today. Leave a comment and tell us what part of the story touched you the most, because your words may inspire someone else. And if you enjoy stories about courage, faith, and the quiet ways that purpose finds us, consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss the next one. May God watch over you, guide your path, protect your family, and bring peace and strength to everyone listening today.